Hello and welcome. My name is Jasmine Waddell, and I'm class of 1999. I'm the incoming chair of the Pembroke Center Associates, and this group is some really remarkable alumni and alumnae and friends who support the Pembroke Center's work. We're delighted to welcome all of you, students, your families, alumni, faculty, and friends to the Pembroke Center's annual Student Prize and Grant Recipient presentations. Founded in 1981, the center was named in honor of the Pembroke College in Brown University and the women of Pembroke and its predecessor, the Women's College. The Pembroke Center is home to Brown's Gender and Sexuality Studies concentration and supports students and scholars such as this group we are honored to have with us here today with scholarships, prizes, and research grants. The center also supports the Christine Dunlap Farnham Archive and the Feminist Theory Archive, preserving the history of Brown and Rhode Island women and the intellectual history of feminist scholars. Both are unique collections and are important resources for scholars around the world. So now I'll hand the podium over to Drew Walker, Associate Director of the Pembroke Center and Director of the Gender and Sexuality Studies concentration, who will be our MC for the afternoon.
Thanks, Jasmine. It's always a pleasure to recognize great student work and to have the opportunity to hear the students speak about it. So it's a pleasure to introduce our student prize winners and grant recipients today. I want to welcome you all again and welcome them and congratulate them on their accomplishments, especially their impending graduation. And to begin, I would like to offer a few words of thanks. First, to all those who have supported these students, their professors, the university, their friends, families, and all other supporters. And a special thanks goes to their advisors, several of whom are here, who guided them through their projects. Here's two over here that I know of. Are there other advisors in the room? Well, Debbie and Matt are representing. Second, a big thanks to the Associates Council, whose support and generosity makes possible so much of what we do at the Pembroke Center, including giving these grants and prizes each year. I'd also like to thank my Pembroke colleagues who assisted in the process of selecting these students and who coordinated today's events, especially Donna Goodnow, who administers the entire process from applications and nominations to processing the awards, Martha Hamblett, Diane Straker, Faith Baum, and our interim director, Bonnie Honig. And a special thanks to our awards committees, especially to Denise Davis, who serves on all of our committees, in addition to teaching in the department and working as the managing editor of our journal, Differences. This year, as in years past, we receive a robust and impressive group of applications and nominations for these grants and prizes. And it's always a wonderful challenge to make the selections. We're proud of the work of this year's recipients and the ways that they embody the mission and values of the Pembroke Center and Gender and Sexuality Studies at Brown. So now, before turning it over to our today's speakers for the rest of the program, I do want to announce two grant recipients who are not here today. It's Sarah Nasita, who received a Linda Pay Research Grant, and Margaret Cohen, who received an Enid Wilson Travel Grant. We congratulate them in their absence. Now, so now I'm just going to turn it over to the students and their presentations. They're going to present in alphabetical order as it appears on the program. Each will introduce themselves and their project, and then we'll have a time for a couple of questions after each presentation. Okay, and with that, Cleveish, turn it over to you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here today. My name is Cleveish Bogle, and I am in the class of 2018. I concentrated in anthropology and health and human biology. For my presentation, or before beginning my presentation, I wish to extend my immense gratitude to the Pembroke Center for the Study of Women and the Barbara Anton Internship Grant for their support in empowering this project and in making this work possible. I would also like to express my deep appreciation and thanks to the Department of Anthropology and the Engaged Scholars Program, particularly Professor Lena Fruzetti and Professor Rebecca Carter, who acted as my thesis advisor and second reader, respectively. I wish to thank my family for their support and encouragement throughout my study. And so, in introduction, this research project was an ethnographic study that entailed an engaged and immersive examination of the role and impact of creative youth development on the participants and perceived community of the community youth organization, Providence City Arts for Youth. I know that was a lot. I'm going to break it down. And so, first, in acknowledging that disadvantaged adolescents may face developmental problems as they age, current research into youth development asserts that the goal of positive youth development is in promoting a positive socio-emotional outcomes. It is thus important to consider the ways in which a deeper sense of belonging and positive youth development framework of self and group identity can drive and manifest pro-social, socio-emotional outcomes. And so, to wrangle with these questions about how community building efforts, as well as positive youth development practices, as underscored in creative youth development, can impact the participants, both youth, students, and the staff administrators of an organization, I undertook this particular research project. And so, for a bit of background, that was that. And so, to go into the history of Providence City Arts for Youth, it was founded in 1992 in South Providence by Sister Ann Keefe, who was a beloved community activist and champion of social and emotional and economic justice. Sister Ann Keefe believed and advocated the idea that access to the arts and to artists supports the heart-centered, empathetic, moral educations of our youth. To this day, the limited resources and funding allotted to arts programs in public schools throughout the state of Rhode Island has led to a gap that in the availability and access to opportunities for self-development, community building, and social change, which artistic and creative activities can provide in the youth who engage in these processes. The mission of City Arts is thus inspired by the creative process of art making, combined with the exploration of ideas that shape our communities and everyday lives. In a nutshell, there are two main goals of the City Arts' current mission model. The first is to increase the number of Providence students engaged in arts-based and project-based learning after and during school. The second is to help develop the next generation of diverse artists to grow professionally as community leaders, teachers, and artists. And so, in determining the curriculum framework of Providence City Arts, it has a multi-pronged mission that provides City Arts youth with exceptional opportunities to perform and to participate in artistic educational programming. These include field trips to local museums, engaging in neighborhood arts service projects, performing at community gatherings, and also in receiving mentorship from the community volunteers who facilitate these programs. And so, to deepen our understanding of what creative youth development means, I offer this definition. The process of creative youth development refers to a focused and motivated process that encourages positive outcomes, including community engagement and positive self-image, as well as increased confidence in self and in one's skill capacities. In a focus on the community organization Providence City Arts, I have grounded this research study into the impact of these practices of creative youth development, to underscore how they transform onto not only the youth participants, but also the staff and administrators who facilitate the programming, indicating a wider impact that can be translated into different levels of society. And so, the structure of this research project will be entailed as such. So the guiding inquiry of this field's work was to investigate who are the people that are working to craft, lead, and to support the creative youth development and community building efforts of Providence City Arts. As key agents in the facilitation of the work of this community youth organization, centered on arts education, youth empowerment, and professional development of community teaching artists, the administrators, and administrative staff members, who each culminate their own experiences in the organization with these positive youth development practices and values as championed at City Arts. And so I volunteered directly in City Arts programs and workshops as a teaching assistant to participate and observe these practices in action. During the interview process of this project, I conducted formal conversations with a total of 11 City Arts employees, including 4 administrators, 5 teaching artists, and 2 administrative staff members. This fieldwork project entailed a deep immersion and engagement in the work and community of teaching artists. And so, one of the preliminary questions by which I guided this research study was, how is community defined, either in general or at Providence City Arts? And so in this investigation, we determined that at its core, community involves people being together, building bonds, and being able to depend on each other, and genuinely wanting to be supportive of one another. In my experiences working with Miss Delilah, a teaching artist at City Arts, I learned more about the responsibilities and practices of the teaching artists at City Arts who lead these arts education programs. During the first week of any workshop session, the teaching artist will lead the young artists in brainstorming and discussing and establishing the community agreement guidelines of their classroom. This community agreement represents a collaborative process of designating the best practices of communication and behavior in the class environment, encouraging respect, compassion, and collaboration between everyone in the classroom community. It's evident in the programming at City Arts that a general theme of respect and patience is underscored in the teacher and student relationship, both in their conversations, in the artwork they produce, and during times of conflict resolution, whether those conflicts originate in their previous school day experience or within the community, because at the core of it all, it's about supporting one another and caring with one another, not necessarily for, because it empowers both sides of that conversation and dialogue. And so, in developing the relationships between the mentors and the students, we gained insight into the conversations as well as the outcomes and the impact of these programs on these individuals. Largely, there is a pride of work in both the young artists and the structural agents, which is with an emphasis on the teaching artists. The nature of confidence building extends to teaching artists in their own creative processes as they develop and participate in the curriculum frameworks that are defined by the values of creative youth development. In the aspect, perfect. So the City Arts Feeding Her Fire exhibit and panel was held in December 2017 and provided the crux of my research study. It proved to be a transformative experience for both the young artists and adult mentors who witnessed the results. A year-long course, the participants were female-identifying young artists between the ages of 11 and 14 who worked alongside community feminist artist activists to create artwork that culminated in this formal exhibition. One of the guiding frameworks of City Arts is the professional development of their teaching artists and their students, as it imbues their competence as well as their confidence. We found that, in a very real sense, student experiences are the primary product of creative youth development, rather than the artworks that they produce. In this way, it is not necessarily the product, but the process that develops these impacts. Teaching artists at City Arts work to ensure that their young artists understand that their work is process-driven and that it is most important to have them reflect on their growth as self-assured individuals and as invested members of the community, remembering to see students' artworks as evidence of the process of student learning and development. And so, in conclusion, as individuals, we both create individual and community impact. And so with this formal analysis of the Feeding Her Fire exhibit, we understood that in placing students in positions of empowerment, allowing them to have a voice in the display of their artwork as well as the creation, we were able to facilitate the development of their confidence, competence, and their compassion, and formally, their identities as artists, as activists, and as invested community members. And so, in conclusion, as individuals, we both create and are influenced by our communities. In the processes of community youth organizations, the prioritization of positive youth development, alongside the creative youth development practices of arts education and a social justice education, have an extensive impact on the socio-emotional experiences of the youth participants, the organizational administration, staff, teachers, and volunteers who participate and facilitate this work and the inherent values. Thank you very much.
Really fascinating talk. Anthropologists get to go out and study other communities and learn about them. Often they end up coming up with insights about the community that they come from. So I wanted to ask you, as you kind of make this transition beyond Brown, if there's stuff that you got from doing this participant observation in this program that you think could be implemented at Brown and other places of higher education. Is there a way that it goes back?
That's a great question, and it's something that definitely stayed with me throughout my experience in this project. As someone who is invested in the impact that community building and a focus on youth voice, in the impact that it can have on the development of those very youth, I think that when we think of the larger concept of how these outcomes can be facilitated in a larger sphere, it is in understanding that youth are active participants in their own educations. And in that understanding, we reemphasize the fact that their voices matter. And I think with Brown, or any organization that is invested in community building efforts in such a regard, it's this emphasis and focus on empowering the voices of youth as well as the actions of youth that can be brought forth to imbue larger social structures and systems and to better the world. Thank you.
I would echo that. Thank you for sharing with us. This is a very exciting, interesting project. I'm curious, the other piece of what you get from it, which is what are you doing next?
Yay, I'm glad you asked. So after graduating from Brown, I will be participating in the 2018 core for Teach for America, teaching secondary science in Massachusetts. Yes. Thank you very much.
everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Brigitte Dale, and I would first like to thank the Pembroke Center for this wonderful occasion and for awarding me the Helen Terry MacLeod Research Grant. I'd also like to thank my incredible advisor, Professor Kelly Colvin, for all of her help over the past year or so in writing my thesis, and my parents for being here today. I wrote my honors history thesis on the British women's suffrage movement at the turn of the 20th century, and I specifically focused on the group of militant suffragettes called the Women's Social and Political Union, or the WSPU. I used my grant from the Pembroke Center to travel to London, where I did primary research at the British Library. I read the suffragettes' self-published journal called Votes for Women, and I was able to glean a sense of the women's own voices and compare how they represented themselves with how contemporary London newspapers and historiography portrayed them. So I'm going to keep it brief today, and I don't have time to share with you all of my findings, but I would like to give you an overview of the incredible women's movement that I was able to study and write about over the past 2 years. In 1908, the WSPU led an unprecedented march of over 500,000 suffragettes through London's Hyde Park, clad in violet, white, and green, and termed by one newspaper as, quote, a richness and refinement of color such as the grandest of military pageants has never supplied, unquote. By 1913, just 5 years later, the same suffragettes bombed the house of the Chancellor of the Exchequer, David Lloyd George, leaving only a hairpin as evidence. The WSPU began a campaign for women's suffrage in 1903, ultimately employing militancy and violence from 1910 to 1914. In terms of chronology, nearly half the movement's lifespan was characterized by nonviolent tactics. Yet, in contemporary media and historical memory, not to mention existing academic scholarship, the entire movement was remembered as being radical from the start. Their contemporaries called them odious Amazons lusting after notoriety. And later, historians reinforced the suffragettes' self-proclaimed militancy, calling the women richly psychopathic. But in my research, I argued that the suffragettes' presence in public, not their later violence, is what made them radical. The suffragettes occupied the same streets as actresses and prostitutes, the most disreputable members of society. The suffragettes disavowed Victorian domesticity by dramatizing their campaign for a public audience. Historians retroactively characterize the suffragettes as radical because of their violence, but contemporaries did so initially because of their presence. The thousands of suffragettes in color-coordinated costumes risked their reputations to perform their desire for political participation. They fought against stereotypes, from dissimulative prostitutes to failed mothers to lesbians. Later, they would risk their lives enduring hunger strikes, force feedings in prison, and sexual assault at the hands of police officers. We expect so-called radical women to be violent so that they seem beyond the bounds of feminine expectations. But we must recognize what was actually radical at the time: women in public. Stereotypes persist about women in power, which recently led women to march in pink pussy hats instead of tricolor sashes. My research examines the performative nature of the WSPU's campaign. By staging a public, performative spectacle to demand political equality, long before violence ever ensued, the suffragettes were radical simply for being there. The legacy of the suffragettes and the organized power of women's movements is seeing a revival. The suffragettes could not say "Me Too," but we can, and even today, we're able to witness the incredible power of women's voices unified in protest. In recontextualizing the suffragettes' purported radicalism, we're able to provide a deeper understanding of women's continued contested relationship with power in the public sphere. And as for me, to preemptively answer this question, after graduation, I will be presenting my thesis research at the Suffrage Centennial Conference at the University of Surrey, and then next year I will be applying to PhD programs in women's history. Yes, definitely. So in my research, I contrast militant versus radical. The suffragettes called themselves militant from the time that they were founded, long before they were ever to use violence. And that's because they were reacting against an earlier generation of female suffragists who would stick to tactics like writing letters to members of parliament or writing petitions. When the WSPU was founded by Emmeline Pankhurst, she and her daughters decided that they would use new tactics that they called militant in order to advocate for the right to vote. And those tactics would include large demonstrations, public speaking, marches, so all putting their bodies on display in the public sphere. That's something that they viewed as militant, but what society viewed as radical.
Can I just interject that you've got the Helen Terry MacLeod research grant, and the person who just asked me that question is the granddaughter of Helen Terry MacLeod.
Thank you so much for being here. Yes.
When and if, I guess is the question, did they need to public support that she was granted the
So women were granted partial suffrage in 1918 and then full suffrage in 1928. And it coincided really with the end of the First World War. The suffragettes stopped their militant activity in 1914 when war broke out, and then dedicated their efforts to supporting their country during World War I. And then at that point, when the war ended in 1918, they began re-asking for the right to vote. And at that point, having participated in the war effort and fighting for democracy on the world scale, they were ultimately granted the right to vote for women over 30 who owned property. And then it would take another decade of fighting in order to receive equal suffrage with men. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Zoe Gilbard, and I am double concentrating in history and public health. This past year, I completed an honors history thesis entitled Confining the Unfit, the Eugenics Movement in Early 20th Century Rhode Island. Eugenics, a term invented by Francis Galton in 1883, was the well-born science, promoting better breeding to achieve a more perfect society. Galton became interested in the possibility of cultivating the human race in the same way that farmers breed animals, weeding out less desirable characteristics and propagating positive ones. He believed that social improvement was possible through biological means, and he wrote extensively about his hypotheses concerning human heredity, beginning in the 1860s, almost concurrently with Charles Darwin's theory of evolution and Gregor Mendel's early genetics experiments. The United States eugenics movement began to flourish in the early 20th century, often dubbed the Progressive Era because of the liberal social activism that proliferated at the time. The American eugenics movement enacted legal sexual sterilization, immigration restriction, marriage laws, and institutional segregation, confining and controlling socially undesirable people. The improvement of the genetics of the population seemed to be in everyone's best interest. The historian Gregory Dorr characterizes eugenics as having ideological flexibility. The goal of eugenics, to be able to improve the traits of the future population by controlling reproduction, was attractive to a wide range of individuals and movements. My thesis was inspired by a newspaper article that I found last spring in the Providence Sunday Journal from 1912. The headline read, "Can we improve the race by a eugenic marriage law?" I wanted to know more about how a eugenics movement played out in Rhode Island. Who was involved? What did participation look like? Rhode Island did not have legalized sexual sterilization, and so it has not been the target of much research on eugenics. I found that the main tools of the eugenics movement in Rhode Island were marriage restriction laws and the confinement of socially undesirable people to asylums and prisons. In addition, I examined individual participants in the eugenics movement in Rhode Island, and I found that there were many intersections between participation in eugenics and in other social movements of the time. In particular, many doctors and scientists were interested in hygiene and sanitation along with eugenics. A Brown professor, Herbert Eugene Walter, whose field was comparative anatomy and whose name now adorns a building on Waterman Street, was a proponent of eugenics as an extension of his studies of biology and genetics. Professor Walter taught multiple courses on eugenics over his time at Brown, including courses on human conservation and the control of heredity. A genetics textbook written by Walter, entitled Genetics, is partially focused on the use of the science to weed out undesirable people from the population. Walter presented at the 1913 Providence Child Welfare exhibit, alongside photographer Lewis Hines, displaying a poster entitled "What is Eugenics?" Here you can see some of the images of the poster kept at the John Hay Library. Walter suggests strategies for increasing good blood and decreasing bad blood. Helen Cordelia Putnam, a gynecologist who practiced in Providence for over 40 years, was a great advocate for the welfare of mothers and children, attending conferences and publishing articles on the importance of hygiene to children's health. She was also a champion of education, including sex education for young people. Dr. Putnam's interest, however, also extended into eugenics. Many social movements of the time found the goals of eugenics to be in harmony with their own utilitarian goals. Dr. Putnam chaired the National Education Association's Committee on Racial Well-Being, calling for eugenics research among undergraduates across the country. Dr. Putnam is only one example of the individuals I examined in my thesis, but she demonstrates the nuances of liberal social activism in the early 20th century. I do not have time today to go into my other discoveries, but I would like to conclude by saying it is imperative that we continue to question the social movements and institutions we are a part of. My research demonstrated that the eugenics movement in the early 20th century, along with being entrenched in the medical and scientific ideologies of the time, was most powerful within the state's institutions, including Brown. The Brown University community, along with many other Rhode Island institutions, continue to use and discuss the population of the state for medical and public health research, and it is important to keep in mind the dark history of these disciplines and the ways in which science can perpetuate systems of harm, discrimination, and exclusion. I would like to take a moment to thank those who made my research possible. First, thank you to the Pembroke Center for providing me with the Steinhaus-Zisson research grant, which allowed me to visit and obtain sources from the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia, as well as the Cushing-Whitney Medical Library at Yale University. Next, I would like to thank my advisor, Debbie Weinstein, for her guidance and mentorship throughout the thesis process. And finally, I'd like to thank my family who is here today for all of their support. This coming year, I will be working at a life sciences consulting group in the Philadelphia area. In the future, I hope to attend medical school. However, I will always be a historian at heart. Thank you so much for being here today, and thank you again to the Pembroke Center for having me.
some of you may not have heard about posture pictures, but some of us who went to this college in the 60s, when we entered our freshman week, we were stripped down to our underwear and marched through the gymnasium and had our photographs taken. This happened to people who went to other elite colleges, Wellesley, Yale, are two that I know of personally. It was part of a eugenics study to see whether or not the intelligentsia of our country were ectomorphs or endomorphs. And those of us have talked who are subject to this scientific exposure have talked about the difference between today and then, because today we would never, ever have agreed to do that. At the time, we felt we didn't have any choice. So it wasn't that long ago, and it's kind of frightening to think about.
I've actually had other older female professors tell me that when they were in college, they had the same thing. Yeah, that's really interesting.
Thank you very much. This was really interesting. It's a history that we can't forget. I also wonder what this means for Brown's physical spaces. I can understand how we and other institutions sort of are tied up in this history. Do you think, as a historian, that has implications for the way that our institutions, our buildings are made?
I think it's actually important to preserve the names in order to continue to explain to people that this happened. So I think it would be useful to have like a plaque or something acknowledging the history, but I don't think that changing the name would be the right step. There are other parts of Providence that I learned about through my research that are still, very present, and I think that their continued existence is important for remembrance. I do think it should be acknowledged in some way so that people can learn from these things. But I personally think that continuing to have the names or the structures to exist is really important for remembrance.
I hope that your research is part of that.
Thank you very much.
Great. All these presentations have been really wonderful. Hi, aloha. My name is Grande. I am a Science and Society concentrator here at Brown University. I'm graduating this year. And before I delve into this research, I would like to take the time to thank my two advisors who are not present, Brigitte Singh from the Anthropology Department and Iris Montero from the Department of Science, Technology, and Society. I would also like to extend my gratitude to the Pembroke Center for Teaching and Research on Women for generously awarding me the Steinhaus-Zisson research grant. With the support, I was able to travel back to Hawaii and conduct fieldwork and explore historical archives. So in this research, this will be the outline. I tell the story of Hawaii's educational development through the lives of 3 women. It is through them that I introduce how ontologies, or ways of being in life, emerge in formative institutions and land-based learning environments. As the driving question of this study, I contemplated, could land-based learning introduce a more embodied sense of shared values for human relationships of the land? And if so, how would we know that we have achieved such a status? To answer this question, I'll start with how this whole project began, which was while I was creating a theoretical sustainable curriculum as an independent researcher at my high school in 2015. During that same year, I got to spend time with a woman named Jessica, who ran Peace Child International in Hawaii. I volunteered to help with planning an event called the World Youth Congress in 2017, which had about 60 participants, students, teachers, educators from around the state of Hawaii. And the photo on the left is of Jessica, and the right is in the conference. So to go over each chapter, governance, consumption, waste, I'll dive into each one separately. The first chapter acquaints my time with Jessica and traces the forms of educational governments that I conceptualized while volunteering and researching the sustainable curriculum. As the main organizer of the event, Jessica drew my interest because of her thinking on education and ways of organizing events. Over email correspondences, in-person meetings, and shared experiences at conferences, and also while volunteering at Hawaiian land stewardship sites, I express what I've learned from Jessica to depict two different ways of education-related decision-making. This screenshot is of our Dropbox folder, which represents one form of decision-making. It's a more loose-ended form, but it's more egalitarian in terms of how people connect to one another. And this is the front of the Hawaii State Department of Education, which depicts the second form. And this is, Hawaii only has one single district of education, and that is probably the lowest throughout the United States. So for consumption, fastening the second chapter to a 1977 oral history of Elizabeth Ellis as a moment through which to conceptualize ontologies of consumption, I present her childhood from the 1910s to the 1920s, and with formal institutions as well as her food and medicinal relationships to the land, and also her connection to Hawaiian ethnobotany. In the same consumption chapter, I identified two consumption poles, locally centered and urban assimilated. Recently, just this past year actually, the Hawaii Department of Education introduced local school options at public schools. So the locally centered photo represents products that come from the islands, while the photo on the right depicts the urban assimilated consumption, where people consume imported food. And just to give you some statistics, about 85 to 90% of our food is imported to the islands. I'm from Hawaii, so that's according to the Department of Agriculture in the state. For the third chapter in Ontologies of Human Waste, I adjust the focus to Hawaii education through a vignette of Isabella Abbott. She remains the most prominent figure of Hawaiian ethnobotany. She became the first Hawaiian to acquire a PhD in the sciences and documented a record number of Pacific seaweeds, or limu, in Hawaiian. I tie her focus to what is known as bioremediation, or the cycle of waste repurposed for matters like consumption. So, opening the term waste to mean more than just garbage cans and flush toilets, I broaden the discussion to sentimental human waste in the form of jealousy, anger, and resentment. The photo on the right is a species of Hawaiian seaweed known in scientific nomenclature as Sargassum echinocarpum, and it's otherwise known in Hawaiian as limukala. This was used for ceremonial purposes to make things right between people that you have strife with, or if you're angry with someone, they would come together and ho'oponopono to make things right. So, in a synthesis, the narratives and knowledges in this ethnography on Hawaii education draws from women. I aim to point out that groundbreaking theories, educational frameworks, and the productions of scientific knowledge stem from figures who identify themselves as minority figures, as opposed to figures of earlier education critiques which have been attributed to European men. And I include Hawaiian education authors as well. My intent is not to condemn existing bodies of European or masculine knowledges, but rather to contribute the story of marginalized figures. When I began my fieldwork with Iolani School in high school, I set out to find where post-colonial Hawaii and the rest of the world would go from the leftover Prussian education system. In conclusion, I posit that land-based learning habitualizes both concepts of ontologies of sustainability, while formative institutions only introduce concepts of sustainability. So if the external world remains beyond our reach, which is inside classrooms, then so will our feelings of fulfillment if we're unable to give back to the original sources that compose our very selves. Mahalo nui loa, or a very warm thank you in Hawaiian. Okay, yes.
Could you give me an example of a land-based learning, a school, and then the other one?
So an example is There's a farm on the northwest side of Oahu Island, which is called Ka'ala Farms, and they have a land-based learning component to education, which is just volunteering outside. And one interesting component of the bioremediation cycle is how people just have waste toilets outside. What you do is you just use a toilet how you normally would and then put mulch on it for compost. Later it ferments. You can put it back into the soil and use it for fertilizer to consume. And the example of an in-classroom learning is just with being inside of a classroom and not having tangible experiences to the land, using a toilet system, sort of like how you saw here. The waste goes out of sight, out of mind, and you don't really see the same connection that you do in classrooms, in urban spaces.
I want to ask you one more thing. Thank you so much, but did you ever look or think about it? I'm just thinking of pioneers who educated their children in the maybe mid-19th century, early, where they basically learned. Maybe they had a family Bible, but most of their learning was outdoors, learning how to work around the farm, soil, and that's how they learned about math, and that's how they learned about science and animals. Would that be similar, or are we talking about just environmental?
So Isabella Abbott actually went to Kamehameha schools in Hawaii, and in her time there, the principal at the time required that women go and garden, and it was a part of their component in education, and so that would count as a component of sustainability or interacting with outside environments, either through farming or gardening. Thank you for your question. Okay.
Great talk. I was wondering, I have two questions. How might you go about quantifying the amount of sentimental waste produced by tourism in Hawaii? And then the second is, in the land-based approaches, what do you see the role for traditional Hawaiian language, land use practices, and ideas of nature, and all of that?
Okay. The first question is somewhat easier than the second one. So, could you ask it again? I'm sorry.
So I'm wondering how you might go about
quantifying the human.
waste that tourism produces in Hawaii.
So I also argue in this thesis that we should make a move back to the humanities for a more qualitative assessment instead of using standardized tests or numbers. And that would be one way to assess human sentimental waste. It would require a lot of thinking and reading. But for the second question, could you ask someone again as well?
I'm wondering, with the land-based approaches that you're advocating, how much of that would be using traditional Hawaiian land use practices as part of the curriculum, language, ideas of nature, all of those kinds of things?
I think because Hawaii's background does have about over 1,000 years of traditional land practices, it would be pretty important or imperative that Hawaii education and language would be included, but I think you can assimilate other countries like France and Chile in ways of being with the land. It would also make it a more global, well-rounded framework. Yep. Thank you.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Deborah Pomeranz, and today I'll be talking about my ethnic studies senior thesis titled Policing the City: How Discourses of Public Safety Reshape New York. My research examines the different forms of policing in the context of late 1970s New York City, at which point there was a moral panic about crime that was related to broader racial, sexual, and economic anxieties. So on this slide, I've included two photos of Times Square. The one on the right, I took myself this past December, and it shows a city that today is renowned for tourism, advertising, culture, and above all, safety. This is the New York I've grown up seeing and hearing about. On the other hand, Lou Suman's 1980 photograph of Times Square was taken at a time when the name New York City was synonymous with danger, decay, and general sleaze. I chose to look at New York during this time because I was curious about how the mainstream perception of the city, and maybe also its material realities, could change so quickly. I was also interested in thinking about race, queerness, and policing in dialogue with one another. The 70s moral panic about crime, as well as its racial and moral subtext, was centered on New York City, but relevant to the country at large. The news, popular, and artistic media spread assumptions about crime in New York. Newspapers highlighted serial killers, which they asserted that the bungling police force would never be able to catch. The 1977 blackout, which lasted for 24 hours, received highly racialized and sensationalized media coverage nationwide. Popular movies of the time depicted New York as dirty and dangerous with a mugger on every street corner. Even the city police fed the fear with this pamphlet titled Welcome to Fear City, which they handed out to tourists in bus stations and airports. Overlaid on the crime panic was a sex panic, where people were worried about sexual economies and sex work, particularly in Times Square. The questions guiding my research included, first, how did perceptions of New York change so quickly, and what did the ways people talked about or practiced public safety have to do with this? Second, what do the state and police do to retain or regain legitimacy when the public loses trust in them to keep them safe? Then, finally, how is policing different when practiced by civilians rather than state actors? What can these differences tell us about community policing and the ways it may be different when practiced by civilians? I explored these questions by comparing the New York Police Department with two civilian organizations, the Guardian Angels and Women Against Pornography. All three groups were concerned with public safety in New York City, but had different ideas about what this meant and how it could be achieved. The NYPD practiced traditional policing as a state organization who would use surveillance and arrest to prevent, but more often respond to what they considered to be crimes. The Guardian Angels, on the other hand, were a group of young people, mostly working-class young men of color, who patrolled the subways to prevent and intervene in crimes similar to the police, but as civilians. They were very popular among the public, but were criminalized by the mayor's office and NYPD. Finally, Women Against Pornography was a national feminist organization based out of New York City. They believed that pornographic imagery and patriarchal violence were the biggest threats to women's safety and used awareness-raising and boycott strategies to fight these. Despite their significant differences, all three groups excluded marginalized New Yorkers, including those perceived as poor, Black or Latinx, gay or transgender, sex working, homeless, and/or mentally ill from their visions of urban citizenship. This physical and imaginative exclusion cleared space for redevelopment and gentrification, profit-oriented city governance, and broken windows policing, a policing strategy that promotes racial profiling and harsh punishment for minor or nonviolent offenses. And these were three sort of things that marked later 20th century New York City, or were characteristic of it. Examining this history demonstrates the broad impact discourses of public safety can have, above and beyond the ways that they influence the police and criminal justice system. It also shows that moral discourses, such as those about sexuality and sexual economies, can shape the public safety apparatus and its goals. Finally, it implies that policing will likely always be exclusionary and violent, even when practiced by non-state actors. In the future, to preempt the questions, I am hoping to continue my research on policing in the US and its disproportionate impact on non-white, queer, and transgender people in an American Studies PhD program. I'd like to thank the Pembroke Center for having us all here today and recognizing my research, the Department of Ethnic Studies, students and faculty, particularly my advisors, Professors Gutierrez and Professor Weinstein. Thank you all. Any questions? Sure.
So what do you think was the biggest driver of change? Did it have to do with the political administration that came in? Was that like the biggest impetus for change?
Yeah, so there was a lot coming together. This was also a moment right after the 1975 fiscal crisis. So there was a lot of economic change as well as a lot of social change. This was sort of the long aftermath of the civil rights movement, where you have legal changes, so rights for people of color, but then also a lot of pushback. And this is kind of in the middle of all of that. But I really think the biggest driver was this moral panic that conflated all these issues, the economic anxieties, the racial anxieties, and the anxieties about crime. Thanks. Mm-hmm.
How did the emergence of the AIDS crisis in the early 80s impact all this? Or was it impacted by the things you described?
That's a great question. So I studied the moment right before the AIDS crisis because things really changed a lot. The ways people could express their sexuality and could engage in sexual economies changed a lot with the outbreak of AIDS. There were new laws that, or like a new legal mood, whereas before the mood had been towards more civil rights and more liberalization, so more freedom for sexual economies to operate. The AIDS crisis sort of reversed that and also had a really personal impact on a lot of queer folks and sex workers in the city. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, hi everyone. My name is Zoey Stockman, and this last year I completed my honors thesis in gender and sexuality studies. This coming year I'll be working on my master's in teaching high school English. I'd like to thank my advisor, Drew Walker, and my second rater, Diego Millan, my family, and the Pembroke Center for awarding me the Joan W. Scott Prize. So my thesis, titled Wicked Witches of the West, dealt with currents of colonial ideology in neo-pagan theory and practice throughout the 20th century. This is part of an ongoing conversation on the meaning of cultural appropriation in neo-paganism. In my research, I found that eclectic neo-paganism borrows from other cultures and religions in ways that trace pathways of colonialism, meaning that white European and North American practitioners draw rituals and symbols from Asia, Africa, and the Americas, divorce these symbols from their contexts, and incorporate them into eclectic neo-paganism. In an effort to understand the origins of this practice and its implications, I looked to the history of neo-paganism to determine where these colonial impulses came from and what kind of work they were doing. The first chapter deals with the history of pagan persecution, and in this chapter I argue that the course of pagan persecution and the Christianization of Europe is inextricably tied to the development of Western ideologies of domination. From the Christianization of the Roman Empire to the witch trials, different campaigns targeting those called pagan have been tools which develop technologies of empire, colonialism, and capitalism. It seems ironic, then, that neo-pagans who claim a descendancy from these historic pagans themselves are caught up in a kind of colonialist logic. This was one framing question of my research. How did some of the first victims of Western civilization become its agents? To answer this question, I looked at the development of neo-pagan theory and practice over the course of the 20th century. I found that at every turn, neo-paganism has been influenced and underpinned by contemporary political motivations, for better or for worse. Beginning with two founding figures of neo-paganism, Margaret Murray and Gerald Gardner, I found that early 20th century neo-paganism was fundamentally motivated by the particular colonial landscape of the British Empire at this time. As this empire began to falter, white Brits were caught up in a racial anxiety around the concept of white indigeneity, and neo-paganism became one outlet through which a desire for indigeneity was expressed. By mythologizing the history of paganism and reviving pagan practices, or, as was often the case, inventing pagan practices, white people were given access to a particular colonialist concept of the primitive. This origin set the stage for the next century of neo-pagan theory. Like Murray and Gardner were caught up in this primitivist urge, other generations of neo-pagans were caught up in other political and social motivations. In the 60s and 70s, these were counterculture movements, second-wave feminism, and the beginnings of New Age. In my chapter on The Spiral Dance by author and activist Starhawk, I examined the relationship between second-wave feminism and feminist neo-paganism more closely, and found that the same critiques of second-wave feminism given by Black feminists and post-colonial feminists can be applied to feminist neo-paganism, which has a distinct tendency to flatten and subsume different experiences of womanhood into a pre-established model of European goddess worship. However, feminist neo-paganism, and Starhawk's work in particular, also contain certain rhetorical strengths, which I will return to in a moment. So moving into the 80s and 90s, I looked at how neo-paganism begins to be captured by a distinctly neoliberal logic. In my chapter on Scott Cunningham's Wicca, A Guide for the Solitary Practitioner, I analyzed the way in which his highly influential theory of solitary practice promotes a distinctly neoliberal worldview. The solitary practice relies heavily on the technique of borrowing from various traditions in order to build that practice. In a solitary practice, the original contexts or histories of rituals and symbols are not important. The only thing that matters is what these rituals and symbols mean to an individual. This invites cultural appropriation because it allows someone like a white American neo-pagan to look at something like a Muskegee war bonnet and say, yeah, that really speaks to me, so I'm going to wear it, with no regard for where it comes from or what it means in its original context. So, given all these points of failure that are contained in the history of neo-paganism, I also wanted to try to point toward what an ethics of neo-paganism might look like. I propose different elements of this in my conclusion, but one central theme is that in order to resist these failures, neo-paganism requires an intentional consciousness around its own constructed nature. Because neo-paganism is a religion, practitioners have a tendency to naturalize their actions, to claim that what they do is spiritual and personal and doesn't have political repercussions. This obfuscates the reality that political motivations have always underpinned neo-paganism, and that the personal is always political. This brings us back to one of the strengths of feminist neo-paganism. Out of all of the neo-pagan movements that I have researched, feminist neo-paganism is the only one which is explicitly political. This political awareness has allowed for a constant internal discussion, reevaluation, and revision, and fosters a critical awareness of the political repercussions of spiritual work. I'm looking forward to potentially developing this ethics of neo-paganism further and finding the tools necessary to meaningfully resist systems of domination. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was, for me, interesting because the thing about religion is not having politicized is kind of ironic. I can't think of a religion that isn't politicized or a religious movement. What are you doing next?
So I said it at the beginning, but that was a while ago, and then I said a bunch of other things.
I was taken by your project.
Thank you. I'm getting my master's in teaching secondary English, so high school English. Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. I'm Emily, and I will be graduating with a degree in ethnic studies. And today I will be presenting my research on what I'm calling the subterranean as a range of aesthetic strategies I found women of color contemporary artists using to imagine different relationships between their bodies and the earth, and in doing so create alternatives to dominant imaginaries and visions of citizenship that often exclude Black, brown, and queer communities. So the first photograph I would like to talk about is by artist Laura Aguilar, who unfortunately recently passed away a couple weeks ago. But Aguilar was a queer Chicana artist from the San Gabriel Valley in California, and on her mother's side, her family goes 3 generations back in that land. And her overall photographic practice often collaborates with her surrounding communities, often Black and brown folks, working class folks, to visibilize these communities not traditionally seen in art history. Her most recent body of work, she takes nude photographs in the Southwest desert, and one could argue that the land and the features of the desert become her collaborators in these photographs. So in this photograph from her Grounded series, Aguilar, you can't really tell it's her because she's obscuring a lot of her body and face and embodies the gestures of the rocks around her. She seems to sink into the rock below and perform the rock's way of being in a way. And so I'm also from the Southwest. I'm from Colorado, and so when I was little, I used to collect rocks, and I would hold them in my hands, and they would feel kind of sticky and warm. And so when I first began studying this photograph, I felt it in my hands, and I think it's because of the artist's choices to forgo human or gendered identifications and begin to look more like rocks, and in doing so activates the photograph beyond the visual dimension into these other ways of knowing and being. And another question I asked about this photograph was, well, she seems very relaxed. She seems like she's exhaling into the rock below her. At the same time, her face is buried in the rock. It must be very hard to breathe. And she must be bracing herself against the rock. So I asked, what does it mean to imagine this desert space with these very durable, hard rocks as a space of shelter and healing? So to deepen these questions, I turned to Chicana Native feminist thinkers such as Ms. Juana Gomen and Maria Josefina Saldana Portillo, who think about the U.S. Southwest and its deep political history of U.S., Spanish imperialisms and settler colonialism that enforce more relationships to land based on property. In fact, in the history of the U.S. Southwest, Chicano peoples were often forced to renounce their ties to indigeneity and indigenous communities in return for access to citizenship and land grants. And so speaking back to these systems of power, Chicana feminist thinker Gloria Anzaldúa has written about a kind of mestiza consciousness, and Anzaldúa talks about la facultad, which is a way, as she argues, of seeing beyond the surface and into kind of this, what she calls the chthonic, or a spiritual underworld, where spiritual knowledges and as well as the traumas of colonization are buried within Chicana women's bodies, mestiza bodies. And so putting Aguilar's photography in conversation with Anzaldúa's theory of the chthonic, or the subterranean space, one might argue that if we go back to the photograph, she's enacting this type of deep perception, imagining a more empathetic way to relate to the land that puts these buried knowledges in both her body and the land into circulation. The next piece I wanted to talk about was by Simone Lee, who is a Caribbean-American artist, and her work often deals with Black feminine subjectivity and histories of, she draws inspiration from histories of Black women's care work, such as secret societies of nurses formed alongside the Underground Railroad. And so in this piece, she collaborated with Teacher Ganesh, another artist, and it's called My Dreams, My Works Must Wait Till After Hell. And it's actually a video, so you can't see from the still photograph, but in the video, you just see the Black female nude figure, her breath, and the rise and fall of her rib cage. And so what I find very compelling about this piece is the ambiguity over whether the rocks are preventing this woman from breathing or actually entering into a different kind of relationship, because the pieces of rock visually isolate the woman's rib cage and draw the viewer's attention to her breath in a world and anti-Black environment in which the breath of Black communities is at stake. So I wanted to bring this piece into conversation with womanist and Black feminist thinkers who have actually written about gardening, rocks, and intimacies between Black women and the earth, relationships that are very fraught also because of notions of property land, but also notions of property in the wake of transatlantic slavery applied to Black women's bodies. Alice Walker, in her work on gardening, has talked about how Black women are expected to ensure care for communities whose survival is not guaranteed, and this labor is often unacknowledged or done in secret, but it is also creative. And so she talks about her mother working the soil and writes, whatever rocky soil she landed on, she turned into a garden. And Audre Lorde has an essay on poetry and also uses the language of rocks in the interior of the earth to describe reservoirs of Black feminist creativity buried within these kind of deep, dark places. And she writes, "The woman's place of power within each of us is neither white nor surface. It is dark, it is ancient, and it is deep. Within these deep places, each one of us holds an incredible reserve of creativity and power, of unexamined and unrecorded emotion and feeling. The farthest external horizons of our hopes and fears are cobbled by our poems, carved from the rock experiences of our daily lives." And so I'd like to think about these pieces as acknowledging another art history of poems made out of rocks and all the implications that might hold. So yeah, in conclusion, I always think that art opens up more questions and conclusions, but I was using the subterranean to think about the alternate forms of intimacy with the earth that these artists were contemplating and how they might pose an alternate vision for belonging in comparison to dominant notions of citizenship based on like space as property. In addition, in these works, it's a very concealed aesthetic, visually kind of hidden, and so they imagine ways for these women to represent themselves in ways that don't like immediately identify racially or sexually a body. And yeah, so that concludes my presentation. I want to extend a tremendous thank you to my primary advisor, Professor Leticia Alvarado in American Studies. I also want to thank Diego Milan, who's here, who read some writing about Aguilar, and ultimately the Pembroke Center for Research and Teaching on Women, who provided me a grant to see exhibitions to help further this research. Thank you.
I was struck by the fact that the two images that you showed something that you also observed about the rocks in your hand, which is that there's, I think, a real textural difference between rock and human skin that is also explored in those images. Does your thesis at all approach that as part of what you talk about, especially in contrast to or in comparison to things like poetry?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to like analyze photographs and film and video from a perspective of a more embodied perspective that incorporates feelings of touch, because you can see kind of the dissonance between ways race and sexuality have been embedded in the visual, and then how by bringing in these other dimensions of the hard texture of rock and the softness, assumed softness of skin, can kind of push back at these very ingrained visual systems of representation.
I was wondering, I feel like female artists who do work around nature and embodiment are often charged with sort of criticisms about their perceived passivity. I think I've seen people critique that of Aguilar's work, and I was wondering how you might respond to that, or how that relates to your ideas of the subterranean.
Yeah, no, that's something I think about a lot too. At first, I really didn't like Laura Aguilar's work because I kind of was like, oh, it's like very cliche, it's like very passive, women in nature. But then when I started looking more into like Chicana feminist theory and Zaldua's thought, it was interesting because of the way that the way we think about nature and women within this binary of power relationships that are like dominant and superior, or active and passive. And so like what happens if we throw that kind of binary away and try to like think beyond kind of the active passive binary? So then that was the way I was like thinking about her relationship, experimental with relationship with the earth, yeah.
Hello, everybody. My name is Natalie Zief. I'm a senior concentrating in education studies. Before I get started, I want to thank my family, all of which pretty much is here right now. So thanks for coming. My advisor, Professor Tracy Steffes, who taught a class called Culture Wars in American Schools, which introduced me to this subject. And finally, of course, the Pembroke Center for the Enid Wilson Undergraduate Travel Fellowship, which really made my research possible. So my thesis is titled Sexuality and Schoolwork in South Florida, Anita Bryant's 1977 Save Our Children movement. Because our time is so brief, I'm just going to give a short overview of what the Save Our Children movement was, who the key actors involved were, and then jump into my research questions and methodology. I'll give a brief overview of some of my original data, but obviously don't have time to get into all of it. And then I'll wrap up with a sort of abbreviated epilogue and explain why I think the Save Our Children movement is significant and worth studying. I think some of my formatting got messed up, but that's okay. So the Save Our Children movement was a religious and political movement to repeal Miami-Dade County's first local civil rights law protecting LGBTQ residents from bias in 3 areas: in housing, in public accommodations, and in employment. The actual language of the law was protecting individuals from bias based on sexual or affectional preference, but the law as it stands protected people who identified as sort of a gender or sexual minority. It was passed on January 18th of 1977 under the guidance of Ruth Shack, who was a Brooklyn-born emigre to South Florida, and she was also the first woman council member for Miami-Dade County. And she partnered with a local LGBTQ rights organization with a long name, the Dade County Coalition for the Humanistic Rights of Gays, and they just went by the Dade County Coalition. And so they drafted a law that Ruth Shack endorsed and sort of proposed to the county commission, and that was passed in January of that year, as I said. It was unfortunately short-lived because of Save Our Children. Save Our Children was incorporated in January, and by June had waged sort of an all-out campaign locally in South Florida to turn local people's minds and hearts against the civil rights law. And on June 7th of that year, they garnered 70% of the public vote and overturned this law. Save Our Children was founded and led by a woman named Anita Bryant. Anita Bryant was a singer turned activist. She was a born-again Christian who lived in Miami with her 3 children and her husband, and she was a nationally known gospel singer who performed in armed forces tours, and also was just a really recognizable face in the United States at that time because she was a spokeswoman for well-known companies like Coca-Cola, Singer Sewing Machines, Tupperware, and most famously, the Florida Citrus Commission. You can see that pictured on the left. It's an advertisement for a pavilion at Disney World in Florida that she helped open. And I mean, Anita Bryant is not an obvious candidate to spearhead this anti-queer rights movement, but she positioned herself in that way due to rhetoric implicating schools, teachers, and child safety to position herself as someone who had anti-queer rights work logically within her purview as a Christian mother. And despite the fact that this ordinance did not specifically mention schoolwork anywhere whatsoever, Anita Bryant honed in on educational institutions to exploit harmful stereotypes and cultural myths about queer hypersexuality and even recruitment of young people. In my thesis, I asked 3 main questions. First, how did Anita Bryant frame herself as an authority on child protectionism? Second, how did she connect with and mobilize her followers? And third, what did her campaign reveal about constructions of gender and sexuality as they relate to ideas of who is fit to be an educator? With these questions, I hope to clarify the particular anxieties, presuppositions, and cultural norms underpinning Bryant's fixation on purging queer teachers from systems of education. And I also wanted to explore how gender and sexuality operate on either side of battles about child protectionism. And specifically, I wanted to focus on Anita Bryant's performance of maternalism, explicit demonstrations of motherhood, and the ways that she presented queer sexualities and gender expression in her anti-queer teacher propaganda. Ultimately, my thesis sought to understand how Save Our Children reinforced a paradigm that juxtaposes queer identity with the capacity to teach, and says that the capacity to effectively teach material in a safe and morally sound classroom environment is mutually exclusive with identifying as queer. To answer these research questions, I used funding from the Pembroke Center to travel to South Florida, where I accessed public records, campaign ephemera, interviews, memoirs, and media documentation at the University of Miami, the University of South Florida, and the Stonewall National Museums and Archives in Fort Lauderdale. I also traveled to the Lesbian Her Story Archives in New York City, and I was able to work with librarians and archival experts there to assemble a consolidated Save Our Children sort of archive that isn't consolidated without that work. And I also accessed a large amount of secondary literature, which consisted mostly of historical and sociological theses and dissertations and also books. Because of the breadth of sources available, I was able to parse apart rhetorical themes from Anita Bryant's movement. I don't have time to get into all of that data, but I can break down 3 of the themes that I picked up on. First, Save Our Children argued that the rights of queer teachers were threatening to the, quote, civil rights of parents. So this is obviously language that is co-opted from language of minority rights from the African American Civil Rights Movement and longer Black freedom struggle in the United States, to make the argument that protecting the rights of queer people to work in schools actually frayed the rights of Christian parents. Second, Save Our Children argued that the rights of queer teachers were special privileges that went above and beyond equal rights. So a really telling Gallup poll conducted in June of 1977 found that of 2,000 local respondents in Miami-Dade, a majority of people thought that LGBTQ people should have the right to equal employment in general, but 65% did not believe that this community was appropriately suited to work in schools. So this just really shows that the general public saw the right to teach in school as too specific, going above and beyond what is constitutionally protected. And finally, Anita Bryant emphasized what I talked about before, the idea that queer teachers are fundamentally hazardous to student safety. And she did this by playing into sort of parents' worst fears about their children's well-being in a really harmful way to the queer community. And in a more theoretical way, she argued that inviting queer teachers and protecting their place in schools was akin to tacitly sponsoring what she called the queer agenda in her language. And this sentiment demonstrates an idea at the core of my thesis that schoolwork is distinct from other professions because its practitioners are essential to cultural reproduction and thus are often forced to embody mainstream values that subjugate not only the queer community but other marginalized groups of people. So a brief word on conclusion and significance of this movement. The Save Our Children movement was unifying on both the political left and right. It helped unleash a new strand of homophobic Christian activism, but it also brought queer activists together. Although the Stonewall Rebellion in 1969 is often thought of as the dawn of the modern LGBTQ rights movement, the episode in Miami brought queer rights organizing to more far-flung places in the United States outside of Los Angeles, San Francisco, and New York City. So in 1977, for example, Kansas City had its first gay pride march, and there were lots of other cities across the country where the Mattachine Society opened chapters where they weren't existing before. And it particularly helped with issues of visibility and legal issues across the Sun Belt and in the Midwest. The movement also exposed the viability of using children, schools, and teachers as sort of political pawns in an anti-queer endgame. And this is sort of a tactic used by the religious right today. And finally, this case study reveals the persistence of norms surrounding teachers as stand-ins for values and other ideas that subjugate the queer community that's independent of other types of employment. So that's the end of my presentation. Again, to preempt the question, next year in July, I'm starting a paralegal position at the Federal Defenders in New York City in a department that represents clients who are appealing capital sentences. So thank you so much for listening.
This presentation in your research, and this is a question about research. When you were reading literature, looking at interviews and newspapers, did they, you said Anita Bryant used queer as the word. Did they really use that? I mean, that seems to be, that was the language they used?
No, so the language they used was most commonly homosexual or even more harmful language, derogatory slurs, and then just gay and lesbian. It wasn't this inclusive, I mean, queer at the time was still a derogatory word. I use it in my research, and I defined it in my longer departmental presentation, but I thought for now, because it's so brief, I wouldn't bring it up, but I talk about my choice to use the word queer in my presentation as sort of an umbrella term in an effort to be more inclusive than the language at the time, which was obviously limiting and offensive. Thanks.
I was wondering if in your research you saw any of the queer activists articulating the values for queer teachers in the classroom, or positive things that they could bring to the classroom at the time.
Yeah, I think more the emphasis was not on saying like queer teachers bring something new to the classroom or something different than heterosexual teachers. It was more saying like, well, Anita Bryant's movement was making the argument that having queer people in classrooms was sexualizing a previously asexual environment, whereas queer activists alongside Ruth Shack and the pro-ordinance contingent were saying these environments are already sexualized, but in a heterosexual way. Simply having a female-identifying professor having a picture of her husband on the desk is sexualizing that environment. Date dances that promote heterosexual couples are sexualizing the environment. Queer teachers are not sexualizing an environment that was previously asexual because there's no such thing. And I think that was more of the emphasis in saying it's not really any different. It's just opening our understanding of appropriate and right and, yeah, just accepting different sexual identifications. Thanks.
Well, I want to say thank you again to our presenters for those wonderful presentations, and thank you all for being here. I think seeing these presentations shows, one, how wonderful the students at Brown are, two, what wonderful work the Pembroke Center is able to support, in large part thanks to our associates, and just how interdisciplinary and broad that research is across the university. So thanks again for coming. Congratulations to the graduates on Sunday. At this time, the Associates Council and the Pembroke staff are going to adjourn to a business meeting. The rest of you are welcome to have coffee. There's desserts on the table, to talk with each other if you have remaining questions for each other. And just enjoy yourself as long as you'd like to stay. Thank you.